If you'd open in your Bibles, please, to Psalm 19, the 19th Psalm. This morning we're looking at fearing God, the fear of the Lord, and the marvelous divine condition that God longs for each of us to live in, and that condition is to be continuously kept in holiness by fearing God. I think the clearest portrait of what Psalm 19 and verse 9 is all about could be seen in the lives of two shepherd boys. Two shepherd boys that both lived a very interesting life. Each of them lived a nomadic life. They lived outdoors. They slept on the cold and damp ground. They looked for good pasture. They led their sheep. They protected their sheep. They were shepherds. They were both young men. They both grew up in Palestine. Different times, almost 1,000 years separated their lives. But both of them had great opportunities offered them after being shepherd boys. One was dropped into a pit, sold for a few pieces of silver, hauled off to a brand new culture, to a brand new civilization, had to learn a new language, had to go from being a nomadic, tent-dwelling, kind of rough person to being in the most sophisticated and most advanced culture of the world. The other one was taken from the shepherd's field and was immediately taken into the palace, and he went from there upward. Both of them were approached by someone else's wife. One of them, who we'll look at this morning, said no. The other one said yes. One of them feared God. The other one didn't. Next week, we'll look at David. David, the shepherd boy who didn't fear God, at least at the time of his sin with Bathsheba. But this morning, Psalm 19:9, and you can look at it, it says, "The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever." If you fear God, if I fear God, our life, my life, your life, will be clean. It will be pure. It will be holy. And it will endure forever. If you don't fear God, our life won't be clean. Your life, my life, won't endure forever. God has really distilled down what He expects from us in the simplicity of this verse. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The fear of the Lord is not developed in a crisis time. What was the difference between Joseph, we'll look at this morning, and David, we'll look at next week? What was the primary difference? The primary difference in those two men is one feared God. And he was aware that God saw him all the time. That's God's omnipresence. God was there. He was aware that God knew the situation of his life, his omniscience. He was aware of God's omnipotence, that the things didn't just happen to him, that he didn't just get tossed in a pit and dragged off by Ishmaelites and sold to Potiphar's house. He feared God. He was aware of God's presence, His watching, His holiness. David, however, had become desensitized to that, as we'll see next time. But a crisis doesn't make a man or a woman. It only reveals what they have all the time been becoming. Joseph was becoming a young man who feared God. What did that mean? Well, it means he'd entered into what Psalm 19 says is the divine condition. The divine condition is living life all the time, surrounded, pressed in by the reality that God is there, that God is watching, that God is listening, that God is actually participating if you're a believer. Remember, that's what the Apostle Paul said to the Corinthians who had forgotten that. They were involved in immorality. The Apostle Paul said, "Don't you know that when you commit immorality, you join your body, which is God's holy temple, to a harlot?" He says, don't do that. Don't you fear God? Don't you realize you're doing that? The divine condition is clean. Fearing God is lovingly acknowledging by my actions that you see me, God. The fear of the Lord kept Joseph pure even in the days of his youth, the days of our youth, which can sometimes be so hard. God had some big plans for Joseph. And Joseph might have forfeited it all for a moment of pleasure. But the fear of the Lord kept him. And the fear of the Lord can keep us. Well, how can we participate in the fear of the Lord this morning? Let me show you why we should before I show you how we can do it. Look at 1 Peter chapter 2. I know I always have my friends, and they say, oh, does that say that in the New Testament? You know, some people are under the bondage that only what's in the New Testament counts. And so for those people, I always find, of course, it is. And it says in 1 Peter, the Apostle Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God. Fear God. And honor the king or the president or whoever's in office. That's a real succinct, rounded way of life that Peter put. But we should, and the New Testament commands it, and the Old Testament commands it, and basically God commands that we fear Him. When should we fear God? When should we fear God? Well, all the time. But when does it happen in our lives? Well, first of all, I think that we will come to fear God when we realize His omnipresence. Now, you're going to be turning a lot of pages, and some of you, you can just write them on the back of the notes section. But those of you that like to come with me, I'm going to start in Genesis, and I'm going to show you when we should fear God. Okay, now that we've established that the New Testament, as well as the Old Testament, says it. Genesis 39. Genesis 39 says the first time that we should fear God is when we come to realize that He is everywhere present, as Joseph did. And what I want you to do is I want you to go from the Potiphar's palace, or Potiphar's at least mansion, and go right to wherever it is that you spend your time and your life, and transport yourself from the fact that this was good for Joseph into whatever is the area of life you struggle with. Maybe you struggle late at night when everybody's asleep and you're watching TV with the remote. Maybe you struggle when you're on business trips and you're walking through airports and those shops are there. Or maybe you struggle when you go to the mall and you're already in debt and you've already got too much stuff, but you always get encouraged when you buy things. Or maybe you struggle every time you go buy food. I mean, I don't know just where your point of struggle is. It's either the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, or the pride of life. But wherever it is, the first step to fearing God is realizing what Joseph realized in Genesis 39, realizing God's omnipresence. God is everywhere present. This is what it says. And this is one of my favorite portions of the Bible. I've read it so many times. In fact, my children have a hobby. They underline the verses Daddy speaks about in church. Some of them, you can hardly see them. They underline them so many times. And they say, you already mentioned it. I said, I know. But Peter said, stir you up by way of remembrance. So I underline them often. This is a good verse. Genesis 39, look at verse 8. But he refused her advance and said to his master's wife, look, my master doesn't know what is with me in the house. And he has committed all that he has into my hand. And this doesn't just count with sexual things. This could be financial things. This could be a same response you have if you have trouble working, or if you have trouble being accountable for finances, integrity. It doesn't matter. The same principle comes through in verse 9. There is no one greater in this house than I. He says, nobody's looking over my shoulder. And my master hasn't kept back anything from me but you, because you're his wife. Now here's the omnipresent God. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin? Not against Dad back in Canaan. Not against my brothers living in tents. Not against Pharaoh. Not against Potiphar. Not even against you, Potiphar's wife. See, the omnipresence of God is when we realize, as Joseph did, that all sin, whether what we would consider little, what we would consider secret or hidden or whatever no one will ever know, is always utterly against God. Ray Stedman was a fabulous Bible teacher. He used to carry Harry Ironsides, who was a tremendous Brethren Bible teacher's suitcases when Ironsides would travel. And Ray, this is many years ago at the turn of the century, but Ray Stedman studied the Bible after Ironsides' legacy came upon him. And I remember in his writings how he would say that what gripped him was when he realized that he was in the aquarium and God was on the outside, and he was like a fish with the backlit, lights over the top and the glass, and he was just in that clear water. And God had his face right up against the aquarium looking in all the time. And that means that wherever you are, whether it was out with someone you're not married to yet last night, or if it was on your business trip this week, or if it's in school in this coming week, that God's face is pressed against the glass of your life. And every single thing we do, and every single thing we think, and every single word that comes out of our mouth, and every motive that surfaces and prompts us to action, that all of those are as vividly portrayed as the graphics on my computer screen. It's in the face of God. You know what Joseph said? God, I'm not going to have moral impurity on my screen. I'm not going to do that. And it didn't bother him. And unlike a lot of other New Testament characters that didn't do things because they were afraid of getting caught, or they didn't do things because they were afraid of hurting their reputation or their inheritance, Joseph is a pure example of the fear of God because of God's omnipresence. He says, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? How much of the Bible did he have? None. None of it was written yet. It was still oral tradition at this time. God's Spirit had not moved on Moses to write the book of Job and to write the Pentateuch. It wasn't on paper yet. He had just heard about it from his dad. His dad had said, I wrestled with God one night up on the brook Yabbok. He said, I slept one night with my head on a rock and God opened heaven. And all those stories Jacob had passed on to Joseph. And Joseph said, thou art the God that sees me. You've got a Bible. Most of you have gone to Sunday school. Most of you have gone to church half your life or more. Most of you listen to the radio. Most of you read Christian books. We all have far more than Joseph had, but most of us don't fear God like he feared him. Most of us don't acknowledge God's omnipresence. We don't acknowledge that everything I do is in the face of God. The scriptural word is emprosthen, before the face of God. If you fear God, you don't do anything that he would not approve of. That's the divine condition. Secondly, when should we fear God? Not only when we come to the realization of his omnipresence, but secondly, when we realize his omnipotence. Now, look at 1 Kings. Keep turning. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, 1st, 2nd Samuel. 1 Kings. There we go. 1 Kings, chapter 19. Because, secondly, a person will fear God when they realize God's omnipotence. Now, these are big words. Omni, all. Potence or potent power, all powerfulness of God. And this is what it says. And the background of the story is God had been using Elijah, and he used him mightily, and Elijah had confronted the wickedness of his day, and he had slain the prophets of Baal and got Jezebel madder than a hornet at him. And now all of a sudden, after doing that marvelous mountaintop act of obedience to God and praying, and the rain had stopped for 3 years and it started back up again. After all that stuff, one little wicked, painted-faced harlot named Jezebel scared the living daylights out of Elijah. And we find him in chapter 19, verse 11, hiding. In fact, he wanted to die, and he's just really in bad shape. And it says in chapter 19 that God told him to eat this little meal he'd given him, and then he takes him into a cave, and that's where we pick up. And then he said, go out, this is God, and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, verse 11 says, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountain, broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. Can you imagine being in a cave during an earthquake? I've been in my house during an earthquake, and it's scary. I ran out of the house. I didn't want to be in the house during the earthquake. You ought to go through an earthquake at least once in your life to realize how fragile everything we know is. I mean, to see houses just going up and going down, just like they're in the wake of a boat, and to see things crumble is awesome. He saw an earthquake out of his cave mouth. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. Verse 12, and after the earthquake and this massive wind, a fire. And I don't mean it was just a little campfire. A consuming fire from the Lord went by. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. Verse 13, so it was, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle. He went out and he stood in the entrance of the cave. And suddenly a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah? How come you're running from Jezebel? I can stop the rain at your prayers and according to my will. I can send winds that can break rock." That's a strong wind that can break rock off of a cliff. "I can send earthquakes that can break down and knock anything humans build down. I can send fire that can consume anything. How come you're here?" And he said, verse 14, "I have been zealous for the Lord of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, and they've torn down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left." You know, as Howard Hendricks said, he was on the pity potty, feeling sorry for himself. And how often we all get down there on the pity potty, sucking our thumb and thinking that, poor me. And you know what we need to realize? God's omnipotence. God says, if I wanted to kill Jezebel, he says, I could squash her in an instant. He said, I'd just not let her heart beat anymore. I could just stop the airflow. I could send a microbe. He says, I could send fire, like lit the altar. I could send fire like he's going to send and consume 50 soldiers just like that. He said, but that's not what I want to do right now. You need to realize my omnipotence. And he did. And he had a glorious ending. And God let him be one of the only 2 people that have ever been on this planet that never died. And he got to be taken up in a fiery chariot up into the presence of God. And he got to come back and see Christ on the Mount of Transfiguration. Now what happened? What happens between the pity-potty party and the fiery chariot? He started fearing God and realizing his omnipotence. And we need to realize, because of God's omnipresence, as Joseph did, that we should not sin, and we should be like Elijah, realizing God's omnipotence, and we shouldn't get down into these depths of sorrow and self-pity. Thirdly, we need to fear God. Look at 2 Kings chapter 6, when we realize his omniscience. Omniscience. And by the way, all great growth in the spiritual life that we've all embarked on, if we're in Christ, all has to do with understanding truth or doctrine about God. And it's not feelings and it's not experiences, it's knowing the truth. If you believe right, you'll behave right. If you believe right, you'll live right. If you're not living right, you're not believing right. You're denying the truth, and I'm denying the truth. And that's why we need to get a hold of biblical doctrine. And that's why we study and look at the Bible and read the Bible through. But look at 2 Kings chapter 6, because a third time that we should fear God is when we come to realize his omniscience like Elisha's servant did. Now, what happens from 1 Kings 19 is God finishes out his work with Elijah, takes him up as a picture of what he's going to do with us. By the way, Noah and the ark and Elijah going to heaven and Enoch's translation are all pictures of what God's going to do that he talks about in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 when he takes his church out of this world. Now, someone came to visit me this week and they said, now I met someone that doesn't agree with the rapture. What should I do about it? And I said, don't fight. We don't fight about eschatology. But it is supposed to be our blessed hope. And what I think is that all those people that think that the beast is going to stick them through and burn them and cut their head off, I say, well, that'll give them more grace. And when they go up to heaven, they'll still be happy. So don't fight with them. Don't fight with them. But I personally believe the Bible teaches our blessed hope. And I'm talk about that when we get to prophetic passages. But all that happened, and now Elisha's taken the mantle. Remember when the fiery chariot went up to heaven, the mantle of Elijah fell out, and Elisha goes over and picks it up. And he said, if the God of Elijah is with me, let's see it. And he takes it and he whaps the Jordan River, and the Jordan River stops and piles up the water, and he goes across on dry land. Wow, that was a neat coat. Been looking for that over at Dillard's. They don't sell those Elijah coats over there. Wouldn't it be neat to just whap, but that didn't happen. But here's what does happen. Look at 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 9. Elisha has a double portion of Elijah's spirit, and he is out there ministering, and he's helping in verse 9. Verse 8 of 2 Kings chapter 6. Now the king of Syria, that's the bad guy, was making war against Israel. Those are God's people. And he consulted with his servants, his generals, and he said, my camp is going to be in such and such a place. Tactical warfare. Strategy. He's saying, okay, let's move up our troops over here at the pass. No one will know we're there. When the Israelites come through, we'll get them. So they got all of this stuff in place. Now look what happens. And the man of God, that's Elisha, sent to the king of Israel, saying, beware, don't pass this place, for the Syrians are coming down there. And when the king of Israel sent someone to the place which the man of God had told him, thus he warned him, and he was watchful, not just once or twice. In other words, this was going on repeatedly. And every time they'd get all their tanks and artillery, or at least chariots and spearmen, over here to ambush the Israelites would go, and they'd come over here, and they were on high ground looking down at them. They always knew before it happened what was going to happen. And so, verse 11, the heart of the king of Syria was greatly troubled by this thing. And he called his servants, and he said to them, will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel? He says, these things are only whispered here in my bedroom. He says, nobody else hears them. Oh, for God. God. That always is a problem when you forget God, that he's listening and watching. And one of his servants knew about the Lord, and says in verse 12, none, my lord, O king, but Elisha the prophet who is in Israel. Now Syria is way up Damascus, 60, 80, 100 miles away. The word that tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. Now, let me just get this in your mind. If God told Elisha what the king of Syria spoke in his bedroom, God knows the words you think in your bedroom. He knows the words you listen to in your bedroom. He knows the words you read in your bedroom. He knows the thoughts you think in your bedroom and everywhere else. And what Elisha was teaching his servant was to realize the omniscience of God, that God is not only everywhere present, that God is not only all-powerful, but God knows everything. Everything. It's one of the most humbling, it's one of the most fearsome things to think about, that God knows everything. And yet he loves me. Still he loves me. Praise his holy name. Well, the servant didn't get it yet. So verse 13, the king of Syria said, in verse 13, go and see where he is, that I may send my army and get him. And it was told him, saying, surely he's in Dothan. By the way, Dothan is where Joseph was when he got thrown in the pit and hauled down. It's interesting. The only two times Dothan is mentioned are these two incidences. But he's in Dothan. And so, verse 14, he sent horses, the king of Syria, and chariots, and a great army there. And they came by night. And they brought, this king was mad. So he sent the whole army. And they just came, and they literally surrounded that city. It was just 100 deep. I can just see it right now. I can see them in the night sneaking up with their sharpened swords and their spears and their chariots. And here's this little Dothan. Dothan was a sheep town. It was a nothing town. It was just out there, unprotected. Puts this massive army around it. In verse 15, and when the servant of the man of God, see, Elisha already knew that God knew everything, was in charge, but the servant didn't. And when the servant of the man of God arose early and went out, there was an army. Can you imagine you're staying in a hotel and you go out on the balcony and you open the door to go get a free cup of coffee. They have them down in the lobby. And you open the door and you look, and as far as you can see are mechanized divisions. And you can see, M1A, 1A, 1A, whatever the newest tank is, and they're just all, the barrels are pointed at you. You ever had a gun pointed at you? How about a machine gun? One is bad enough. I remember once when I was arrested by machine gun point, and this kid had an AK-47 pointed at me and arrested me in Albania once. And I thought, I hope that kid doesn't have his finger on the trigger. He's not old enough to even carry that gun, let alone point it at me. One gun scared me. Can you imagine having the whole army pointed at you? He woke up, scared him to death. And so he ran. And the servant said to him, verse 15, oh, Elisha, what are we going to do? Now here's someone that fears God. Elisha said, don't worry. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And then Elisha prayed, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes, let him see. And then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, and this is wonderful, and this is exciting, and this is what all of us need. All of a sudden, after Elisha's prayer, the fellow goes back after his cup of coffee, and he looks out, and this time when he looks, he sees the little piddly army of the Syrians, and then he sees the hosts of God. I remember one angel killed 185,000 a little earlier. 185,000. One. And he saw innumerable fiery hosts of the Lord surrounding this. And what the Lord was saying is, if I wanted to get rid of them, I could evaporate them on the spot. Don't worry. When should we fear God? When we come to realize His omniscience, that God knows what's going on. God knows the end from the beginning. God knows all things. Known unto God are all things from the beginning. He already knows how it's going to turn out. He already knows when you're going to get whatever it is that's going to end your life, if your life ends and Christ doesn't come and get you. He already knows all that. He already knows when and where and how tragedies from our perspective are going to happen. But they're not tragedies. There are no disappointments for a Christian, only the appointments of God. And that all comes when we acknowledge His omniscience. And that's why we should worship the Lord and fear Him, because God is everywhere present. God has all power. God knows everything. Let's turn to another one, Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah, it goes 2 Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Isaiah, there it is, chapter 6. By the way, it's not often emphasized nowadays, but if you really want to know the Word of God, you ought to know the books of the Bible. I meet people all the time that don't know, I'm adults, and they don't know the books of the Bible. And I think that computers are almost a blight to our society because people hardly touch the Bible anymore. They have all their, and I'm a pro, I really like computer-aided study, but not if you neglect the book. And you really ought to, no matter what your age is, know the books of the Bible. I was just talking with someone, and I mentioned that I was preaching on Obadiah. And they said, what? I said, Obadiah. What's that? I said, it's a book of the Bible. They didn't even know it was in there. Can you imagine if they bumped into old Obadiah in heaven and didn't know he wrote a book of the Bible? How embarrassing that'd be. So you ought to learn at least the books and read them all. But look at chapter 6 of Isaiah. Because the fourth time that I believe we should fear God is when we come to realize His holiness. Not only the great attributes of omnipotence and omnipresence and omniscience, but His prime attribute. And the prime attribute of God is not love, and it's not mercy. The prime attribute of God is His holiness. And that's the least talked about. And that's the least desired one in our age. And everyone has grandfatherly put God off as a benign, soft-spoken Jesus in the corner. And they've forgotten that God is an infinite God of holiness. Holiness. Isaiah came to realize the holiness of God. Chapter 6, verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of His robe filled the temple. He saw God as He was, and God is holy. And above Him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their face, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. You notice that it took 4 of their wings to serve God, and only 2 to do work. They worshipped God, and then only 2 of them were working. We work more than we worship, but they worshiped more than they worked. And they cried to one another. And remember, I told you this before, that the Hebrews, the way they underline stuff is they don't put bold and caps and underline like you might on a birthday card, love, 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 and you underline it. And they don't use colorful colors, and they don't use italics. The way the Hebrews would emphasize something is they would repeat it. And this is the ultimate expression of God's holiness. They say it 3 times. And it's not stuttering. It's utter, awesome reverence. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory, as we talked about last week. And when they declared that, it says the posts of the doors were shaken, and the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, and all he did is he got one little tiny glimpse of the holiness of God. He saw God as He really is, holy. Now, let me tell you this. You won't fear God if you don't see Him as He is. And if I see Christians, and if you see Christians who are living abysmal lives, there's no discipline in their life, there's no fear of God in their life, there's no personal holiness in their life. You know what I know? I know one thing clearly about them. They don't know anything about the holiness of God. Because look what happens in verse 5. As soon as he saw God as He was, he saw himself as he was. And you know what? He just picks one thing. He says, I'm a man of unclean lips. must have had a little problem. Maybe he liked to tell stories. Maybe he was one that exaggerated for his own benefit. Maybe he's one that was disrespectful. I don't know what his deal was. But that's what came to his mind just like that. He says, I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of people of unclean lips, and mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And one of the seraphs, the seraphim, flew to me, having in his hand a live coal, which he had taken from the tongs of the altar, and he touched my mouth. You know, when you see God as he is, and when you realize what you are, the first response from our heart is we want him to clean us. You know, that really is the first response. My little 3-year-old this week, I spoke to him about something he did and talked to him about it and shared the scriptures and everything else. And I said, what are we going to do about it? He says, I'm going to pray and ask God to clean me. I thought that was a great response. Don't they have profound responses? Because he knows that when he gets in the mud, he has to be cleaned. And when he gets his hands sticky and his face sticky, he has to be cleaned. And he realized what he did was wrong. And he said, I'm going to ask God to clean me. And he saw the difference between what mom and dad could clean and what only God could clean. And as soon as Isaiah saw himself as God saw him, he says, clean me. And he did. And he touched my mouth, verse 7, and said, behold, this has touched your lips. And it came from the altar. And the altar is a portrait of the great sacrifice of Christ. And it's only through the sacrificial death of Christ. It's only through his blood poured out for us that we can be cleansed. And when he went to God and said, clean me, God cleaned him. And that's because he feared God. He realized his holiness. I bet he didn't go back and tell the same stories anymore. I bet he didn't laugh at the same jokes. I bet he didn't do whatever he was doing to make his mouth clean. And when you get a little picture of the holiness of God, you don't go right back to whatever it is that defiles you and me from God's holiness. What's interesting is God takes unholy people and he uses them. Because I heard the voice of the Lord saying, who shall I send and who will go for us? In verse 8, and Isaiah said, with his newly clean mouth, here I am, take me. You know, if you let him clean you, you can let him use you. Now, God does use unclean vessels. God uses broken vessels. God uses strange vessels. But God uses and keeps clean vessels. The others he uses and casts aside. Nebuchadnezzar used Cyrus. He used Balaam. He used Balaam's donkey. But he keeps those that are clean. They're vessels of honor. When should we fear God? We should fear God, first of all, when we come to realize his omnipresence, as Joseph did. Secondly, when we come to realize his omnipotence, as Elijah did. Thirdly, when we come to realize his omniscience, as Elisha's servant did. We should also fear him when we come to realize his holiness. One last one before we go. Look at Daniel chapter 4. It goes Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. Daniel chapter 4. We should fear God when we come to realize his sovereignty, as Nebuchadnezzar did. That's a great lesson to learn, that God is in charge and I'm not. You know, rich people have trouble with that. That's why the Lord said, few rich people get to heaven. You say, oh, good, I'm not rich. Yes, you are. You're rich this morning. I mean, unless you're in jail for poverty, you're rich compared to the rest of the world. We're rich. Far beyond, some of us are far beyond anything we could comprehend, but we're rich. Look at Genesis 4. Here's one of the richest men in the world. They always talk about how great Rockefeller was because he was rich before income taxes, and they talk about, the Rothschilds, and they talk about the Vanderbilts. Well, this guy was rich before anybody was writing books. I mean, this guy ran the world. He was, in God's estimation, the wealthiest empire. He was the Babylonian head of gold. Do you know why he was so rich? On Wednesday nights we learned this is the fellow that knocked off Nineveh. And Nineveh was the biggest city in the world, in the ancient world. Nineveh, Jonah, and the whale, and Nineveh. And Nebuchadnezzar came and took all the riches of Nineveh and added them to his own. That's why he became the absolute wealthiest man of all. Pure gold, solid gold image he made of himself, 60 feet high. Okay, look at chapter 4. And I'll start in verse 23. This is, by the way, chapter 4 is one of the more interesting chapters in the Bible because this chapter, as far as we can tell, is the only chapter of the Bible that wasn't written by a Hebrew prophet or someone associated with a prophet or an apostle. This chapter was written by a pagan king, a Gentile, Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, from all just reading it, it looks like he wrote it himself, and God inspired him to write it. But listen to his testimony of what happened, starting in verse 32. Because we should fear God when we come to realize his sovereignty like Nebuchadnezzar did. And it says, and they shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. This rich guy that lived in robes and palaces and had hanging gardens that were a wonder of the world is going to live with the oxen. And you'll eat grass like a cow, and 7 times shall pass over you, most likely 7 years, until you know, listen, that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and he gives it to whomever he chooses. That's called sovereignty. And God says, I'm going to make you crawl around your hands and knees, and I'm going to make you eat grass, Mr. Big Shot, until you finally lift up your head while you're munching the grass and look up at me and say, you rule, Most High God. He said, when you do that, I'll bring you back. Well, that's what happens. Verse 33, in that very hour, the word was fulfilled. That's God's omnipotence. Whatever he says happens. His omniscience, he knows it's going to happen. His omnipresence, he's there to make it happen. His holiness is a standard he judges it by. His sovereignty is that he does what he wills for his glory. And he was driven from men and ate grass like an ox. And his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers. And that's why it wasn't 7 hours or 7 days. I'll tell you what, it takes a long time to grow that much hair and to look like an animal. And his fingernails became like bird claws. And at the end of the time, this is why we think he wrote this chapter, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will. That's his sovereignty. In the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, no one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom and my honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles restored to me, and I was restored to my kingdom. And excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth, and his ways are justice. And those who walk in pride, he's able to put down. When should you fear the Lord? When you come to realize his utter sovereignty. When you come to realize that God put you where you are, God made the unchangeable features of your life, God has worked out all the minutiae of every part of your life and mine, known unto God, were all the days of my life. They were written in his book before I lived one of them. Why should we fear the Lord? Because he already is in charge. He already knows everything. He's everywhere. He has all power, and he's utterly holy. And only he can live my life for his glory. I can't. Joseph came to fear God. It's portable. You can take it anywhere. Chuck Swindoll tells a story of how he got off the Marine landing craft in Okinawa, and as soon as the craft door hit the sand, all the men ran down to the red light alley to have their fun. He was all alone, and he had a Bible down the bottom of his duffel bag. And they all stopped the Jeep and said, hey, you coming? He said, no. You know, it's portable. It works anywhere. It works in the Marine Corps. It works at school. It works at home. It works when nobody's watching. It works when your parents are gone, when your wife is sick, when your husband's away. It works all the time. Fearing God, livingly acknowledging that you, God, see me. And when you come into that point of life, when you come to that acknowledgement that God's everywhere present, he knows everything, he has all power, he's utterly holy, and he's sovereign, then you enter into the condition of fearing God and saying, how can I do wickedness against the God who sees me? It's what we've heard. Let's bow before the Lord and ask him to bless his word to our hearts. Oh, Father, I pray that we would realize that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And wisdom is skill in living life in a way that is pleasing to you and that is actually the best life we could ever live. And I pray that more than deciding how much time we're going to invest in church and ministry and how much we're going to read the Bible how much we're going to give to support your kingdom work, all of which are vital, that the first choice we'd make this year is that whether it's for the first time or just to renew, we're going to say, God, I'm going to fear your presence, your knowledge, your power, your holiness, and your sovereignty. And I'm not going to do wickedness and sin against you. Now, if we do sin, you're faithful and just to forgive us if we'll confess and agree with you. But Father, you want us to live in holiness. Not getting as much as we can and walking close to the edge as we can. You want us to draw close to you. And you want us to purify ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and of the spirit. And you want us to perfect holiness. And that's what grace teaches us, that we deny ungodliness. And I pray that this morning, that we would either renew or begin a life in the divine condition of fearing you. We pray in Jesus' precious name. Amen.